Kia ora. We might just get started. Thank you. I ngā iwi, i ngā mana, i ngā hoa mahi, tēnā koutou katoa. E mihi ana ki a koutou, kua tai mai ki te tautoko tēnei kaupapa. Nā mihi nui ki a Professor Kevin Fox, te kai kōrero o te rā, tēnā koe. Ko Karen Fowley toku ingoa, no mai, haere mai ki te tai ohanga. So thank you, everybody, for coming today. It's really wonderful to see you all here in person, but also online to hear from today's speaker in the Treasury Guest Lecture Series. And I'm very, very, very warm welcome to our presenter, Professor Kevin Fox. It's really lovely to have you here, so thank you for giving us your time. Before I introduce Kevin in a little more detail, I just need to go through the quick health and safety briefing for those of us who are in the room. So in the event of a fire alarm, please follow Treasury staff to the nearest exit and progress down the stairwell to evacuate the building. Don't use the lifts. Hopefully they won't be working. In the event of an earthquake, drop, cover, hold, practice your turtle, stay in the building until instructed by a warden. Bathrooms can be found to the left-hand side of the kitchenette. So you walk straight through, go right and down that way somewhere. So if you need the bathroom, that way. So just a bit of context, I guess, about this seminar series for those of you who are new to it. It's under the theme of productivity in a changing world. Our theme emphasises that productivity is widely accepted as a key foundation for economic development, prosperity and overall well-being. And as the world around us evolves quickly, New Zealand, like other countries, faces the challenge of maintaining and lifting productivity in the context of significant technological, social and environmental shifts. We're hosting a range of speakers to explore the implications of these trends for New Zealand's economic and productivity performance and the sustainability and resilience of our economy. So now let me introduce our fabulous speaker, who we're really thrilled to have with us here today. Kevin Fox is a Professor of Economics and Director of Centre for Applied Economic Research at the Sydney University of New South Wales's Business School. He works primarily in the field of economic measurement with a focus on productivity and prices. Kevin's research on the use of scanner data and price indices has changed inflation measurement in multiple countries, including here in New Zealand. He has worked extensively with firm-level data, and his current research interests include the valuation of free digital goods and the effectiveness of public R&D funding. Kevin is a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia and advises multiple agencies, including the Australian Bureau of Statistics, Productivity Commission, and the United Nations. Today, Kevin will share his insights on the role of government and the policy options available for stimulating innovation. He will talk about his latest work around the effectiveness of alternative uses of public R&D funds. This is very relevant to all of us here, given low business R&D is often cited as one of the potential reasons for our lagging productivity performance. And despite increased public spending on innovation and industry support and growing business spending on R&D, New Zealand's public and private spending varies considerably by industry and also remains low compared to OECD countries. It's important for us to understand any opportunities for improving the impact of public R&D spending on economic performance and also in stimulating broader private sector investments. Just in terms of the logistics, I'll soon invite our guest to deliver his presentation. Kevin will present for around 40 minutes, and then we will have the remainder of the time for questions. We will allow questions from the room and also from the online audience, which we'll be facilitating with our lovely helpful help desk on the side here too. So thank you very much for being here today and supporting this. You guys have been doing a fabulous job at the Treasury Guest Lecture Series. We will use the Q&A functions in Teams, so please post your questions in there if you are online. And if you have a technical query, please use the standard chat function. So now over to you, Kevin, and welcome again. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Always lovely to be back in the mighty homeland. So thank you very much for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be here again. I was just remembering the last time I presented in Wellington, in fact, in this room, I believe, it was February 2020. A devastating pandemic swept the world immediately afterwards, causing great social and economic disruption, devastation. I hope that doesn't happen after this seminar. So today I'm going to be talking about impacts of R&D funding on innovation and productivity. Now, you might think, as someone who works at a university, I have a bit of a vested interest in this because some public funding for R&D goes to universities. So how do I defend myself against the accusation that I've cooked up something here that shows that giving money to universities to do research is better than any other use? Well, there is an idea of submitting research plans before you actually do the research. And I have to say, I think I've achieved that this time. That when Hamid asked me what I'd like to present on, I said, well, I don't know. Something I've been meaning to get back to is looking at this issue of public funding, effectiveness of public funding of R&D and the impact on productivity. So I had an idea how to do things a bit differently. So I said, I'll do that. And I thought, oh, plenty of time to get around to finishing off that research. So the results I'll be showing you today, I got out late Monday night. I wrote up the slides. I was preparing them until 1 a.m. this morning. So I don't think I can be accused of cooking the results. I'm just taking the results as they came because I didn't have any time to do anything else. So so let's make a start. Now, for those of you who perhaps online who saw my talk in Auckland, I'm sorry, the first few slides are going to be a bit repetitive, but there is new stuff that follows. Okay, so first some references. So the work I'm doing is backed by research. This is to just reassure you that there is some research, and we're building on a stream of work in this paper. So first I'm going to talk about the productivity slowdown, then I'm going to talk about how to decompose productivity growth into what I think is a meaningful way. And I'm going to use that productivity decomposition then to look at the effectiveness of R&D spending by governments to try and support productivity growth. Okay, first, just to be clear about what I mean by productivity growth. It's the growth in outputs not explained by the growth in inputs. And I'm going to focus on multi-factor productivity growth rather than labor productivity growth, which I know is popular in policy circles because of the relationship, or the hoped relationship, with wages growth. But it's just capturing part of the overall productivity picture. So I prefer to focus on multi-factor productivity, where the input is not just labor, it's an index of capital and labor, so an aggregate of those two things. At the national level, usually value added for the country is taken as the output measure, real value added. Okay, index numbers are used to calculate productivity by national statistical offices such as Statistics New Zealand. Real value added growth is calculated using a Spears index. Okay, that's consistent with national accounts. Even if you're looking at industry level, value added of an industry is constructed using the Spears index. If you don't know what that is, that's fine, but it's just everywhere. Real GDP is calculated by the Spears index by most nations around the world. Input growth is a Turnquist index of capital and labor. That's how you aggregate those two inputs together. And this is the Turnquist index is used by the US, Australia, most countries around the world, and constructing multi-factor productivity indexes. So something to note here is there's no econometric estimation involved. So often when people think about productivity, they think, well, production functions, you're making all sorts of assumptions. No, that's not what national statistical offices do. They just use index numbers. So that means that productivity is rather volatile. So there's no error term involved to capture any excess volatility or anything like that. So it's all just there in a ratio of indexes, an output index divided by an input index. Okay, so that's how it's done, but how do we interpret that? Well, often productivity growth is equated with technical progress. So this implies that you can improve productivity growth if you invest in science and technology innovations. That's the way to do it. And this is what the STEM lobby pushes in countries like Australia very heavily. But if we want to get productivity going, we need to invent new things. It also implies that a decline in productivity growth is technical regress. we forget how to do things. Well, that doesn't seem right, particularly not in this digital age. We don't lose blueprints. Right? So the assumption of technical regress seems inappropriate. So we've got to change the way we think about productivity as not only just being technical progress, movements out of a frontier, but perhaps movements towards a frontier. Or and if you're not achieving great productivity growth, perhaps that's because not a lack of innovations, but perhaps you're becoming less efficient in the use of your resources. So it's better to think of productivity growth as being composed of these two components, technical progress and efficiency change. There can be other components as well, but efficiency change, what I mean by that is efficient use of the resources you have. So what's this productivity slowdown? So this is the picture for New Zealand. You see the MFP growth there. It's very volatile. So there's no error term, so it's jumping around. This is from the OECD database. Originally, of course, the data come from Stats NZ, but you've got MFP growth jumping around there, and you've got this black line, which is a trend I fitted to the data. It's not official. It's just a fifth order polynomial I put through to see kind of where the trend could be. You notice it's sloping downwards over time. And this period after 2004 is lower than the earlier period. And so this is the productivity slowdown that has occurred in most industrialized countries. So New Zealand's experience, but if we look at other countries, US is a bit different. It had that decline after 2004, but it's picked up recently. It's unclear whether that's going to continue there. But you see United Kingdom, it's been sloping downwards, particularly after 2004. This is Germany, same thing. Canada's a bit wild. I think there's some measurement error there. France going down, Italy, Japan. There's Australia, it's kind of down, but, there was a big dip there. So let's have a bit more of a closer look at this. So I will just note that, there was productivity growth around this period. So that's the productivity golden period for Australia, sort of the mid-90s onwards. It's unclear whether we're entering a new golden period. It's certainly not as high as the hump we had earlier. But this is not, it's still very poor productivity performance. It's below 1% growth a year. And so this leads to the perception that we haven't had any productivity growth in Australia for a number of years. It's not quite true. There has been some. In fact, there's been some in some industries that has been quite dramatic. So this is the official ABS, Australian Bureau of Statistics data by industry. And you notice this red line here. Wow, that's agriculture, forestry, and fishing. Isn't that wild? Very high productivity growth. The next is financial and insurance services, then information, media and telecommunications, etc. So if you're above 1 here, it means your productivity has grown since 1990. This is accumulated productivity over the period since 1990. So it's kind of the level, accumulated growth rate, so it's the level of productivity relative to 1990. So you see a lot of industries have had very strong productivity growth. So it's not true there's been no productivity growth in Australia. It's just that it hasn't been in all industries. So there are these problematic industries down here where there's been rather poor productivity growth, and that includes mining. So Australia has probably got very wealthy because of mining, but its productivity growth is terrible. So one policy prescription is if you want to raise productivity growth in Australia, stop mining. The thing is, it's profitable, but it has low productivity because of the way that productivity growth is calculated. There's been a mining investment boom, which meant a lot of investment went in and there was no extra output because of production lags. But this is not the job of the Australian Bureau of Statistics to do adjustments like that. That's up to the analysts. They can't do those sorts of lag adjustments for all these industries and make those judgments, and so they don't. But for example, the Australian Productivity Commission looked at that and found that investment lags and mainly investment lags explained a lot of why mining productivity was poor. So we know something about the poor performance on these industries. So maybe you can explain some of it away. Their end result is this black line. This is the market sector. I just used 12 core sectors rather than the full 16. So it's what in New Zealand, I believe, is called the former market sector. That's what I prefer to focus on. So here's the productivity growth in the earlier period, and then this flat line. So this is what people are concerned about. Right? Why hasn't it continued to grow and increase the prosperity of the nation? Well, it's being dragged down by a few things here, but is that it? Oh, before I go to the next slide, just one thing. Don't you think this is pretty wild, all these huge dips? This is another thing about the calculation of productivity. For agriculture, there's a missing input, an unmeasured input, and that's water. So these two downward spikes were drought periods. And so water disappears, your inputs are still lying around, not being used, but the outputs disappeared. Now, if you were to measure the fall in water input, then it would balance the fall in output. This one is bushfires that devastated agriculture in Australia. And we've had a pretty interesting time, late 2019, massive bushfires, 2020 pandemic, but also pandemic plus rain. It rained. It started raining in Australia immediately after the bushfires, and it didn't stop raining for 3 years. Really, it was just torrential rain, unbelievable. And rain is good, and agricultural productivity zipped up. Okay, so that's what's going on there. So each industry has a story. But if we look at these two sub-periods, this earlier period up to 2003-4, compared to the later period up to 2001, 2022, these fiscal years, we see across all these industries that the green bars are longer than positive and longer than the red bars. In fact, some of the red bars go negative. Okay, so average productivity growth was higher in the earlier period than the later period for all industries, except for arts and recreation. Who knows what's going on there? So this is stunning. You can say, well, we can talk about these different industries and explain things away, but still, even for agriculture, forestry, and fishing, which had such great productivity growth, it was higher in the earlier period. So what the heck happened to influence all these sectors in a similar way that they all slowed down? It wasn't just one sector, it wasn't just mining causing a drag on things, it's across all sectors. And a similar, the similar diversity of experience in New Zealand. I'm sorry I didn't have time to go through the statistics very carefully for New Zealand. I did a few little plots using the wonderful R Shiny, which is on the Productivity Commission website. And I really enjoyed reading the report, Productivity by the Numbers, and I've ripped this figure off from there. But if you just look along the x-axis here, this is labour productivity growth, and you see that some industries have had very high labour productivity growth on average from 2000 to 2019, and some industries have had very low productivity growth, and that's most of the industries. So there's a real diversity of performance. So it's useful to look at the industry level numbers, but this suggests there's something common going on across all industries, that even high performing industries have slowed down. Okay, so productivity decomposition. Let's have a look at this. So this draws on some work I'm doing with a couple of former students and a regular collaborator, Owen Dewart. And this is looking at the Australian market sector. We decompose value-added growth, and the 5 main components. 3 of them relate to multi-factor productivity. Okay, technical progress, efficiency change, and an input mix firms, how industries respond to change in factor prices, input prices. This is minor. These are the 2 main things: technical progress and efficiency changes. Okay, so how do we implement this method? Well, we start off in an environment which is kind of like a linear programming approach, a data envelopment analysis. We could try and work out, we need a best practice frontier. We could try and work that out econometrically or with linear programming. We use something from the linear programming literature, which is a free disposal Hull approach. We don't make any assumptions on convexity of isoquants, etc. So we don't make restrictive assumptions on the technology that's available. We don't, it turns out using some mathematics that if we assume constant returns to scale, we actually don't have to use even linear programming. We just have to calculate a few things. I can't go into the details here in the time available, but it's very, very simple to implement. And in fact, my former student, Shui Zheng, has written R code, an R package. It's available for download from Crayon, and it will do this for you. So it's very, very easy to implement. And so it's simple enough to be implemented by statistical officers. Now, key thing here is that we rule out technical regress because we don't think that should happen in a modern economy. Okay, so we've got multi-factor productivity decomposed into these three components. We're not going to focus on this C thing, the input mix, but T is technology index or level of technology index, and E is a level of efficiency index. So this is a log index here, and so we're doing it in log, so everything adds up rather than because it's multiplicative. But we want our eyes work better at graphs with things are additive rather than multiplicative. So this is in logs. Our measure of MFP is this one here. It's a weighted industry approach. It's the black line. The ABS measure is the blue line. The difference between them is that the ABS, to get the aggregate aggregate market sector productivity, they add everything up, add up all the nominal value added and then deflate that, etc. Whereas we work out industry level productivity and then weight that all up. So it's just a different way of doing it. So we have a bottom up approach, whereas they just sort of have just work out the aggregate market sector values and go from there. So using our approach, we're able to look at industry contributions to these components, technical change, efficiency, and input mix. And so these gold bars here, these are the levels of technology for the market sector. And down here, these gray bars, they're efficiency, or in this case, inefficiency for this market sector. And you see these bars have been getting longer over time. So there's been growing inefficiency. And these things have to sum up to the black line there. Okay, so if the black line going up is good, that's productivity growth, but it's been sort of meandering down here, not because of a lack of technical progress. There's been plenty of innovation and things being invented, but growing inefficiency. And we do a decomposition by industry as well. And it's quite different industry experiences, but this is the aggregate picture. So this suggests that if you want to have productivity growth, you've got to get rid of this inefficiency. That's the easy way of doing it. It's easier to get rid of inefficiency than to invent new things. But let's see. R&D and innovation. So many governments think that more innovation will help improve productivity growth. The situation in Australia is similar to what Karen mentioned here in New Zealand. The gross domestic expenditure on R&D in Australia is about 1.6% of GDP, whereas the OECD average is 2.7%. And before the last election, the Labor Party, before becoming government, they committed to raising R&D to 3% of GDP. Since becoming government, they've kind of forgotten. They don't mention that very often. I'm involved with the Australian Group of 8 universities, and we're trying to help them work out a plan of how to achieve that, which may or may not include suggesting that universities get a bit more R&D funding. So, government support, increase R&D funding can play a role in this. Right? The government is not passive in this. It provides R&D funding. But what's the best way of spending money on R&D to increase productivity growth, if that's the policy goal? So here's how the Australian government spends money on R&D. So there's 4 broad categories. There's Australian government research activities. That includes things like CSIRO. That's a Commonwealth Science Innovation Research Organisation. So they're the people who invented Wi-Fi. That's where Wi-Fi comes from. It was an Australian invention supported by, it wasn't the goal of the research. It kind of was a side invention. It's got defence in there as well, and just other government R&D. So it's mainly CSIRO that is receiving funding under this research activities, or research agencies is another way of thinking about this. Business enterprise sector, here are tax incentives for firms to invest in R&D. There's higher education. These are research grants that people have to apply for. There's also block research grants where universities are rewarded for their performance in research, and some other, some old funding frameworks, etc. But it's mainly research grants and block grants based on research performance. And then we've got multi-sector, which is health research, which has been increasing a lot in recent years, but also includes rural R&D corporations, support for them. So a real mixed bag in the multi-sector. So those are the 4 main categories. So R&D tax incentives. So these seem like a good idea, provide incentives for firms to invest more in R&D. But firms can respond to tax incentives by relabeling other expenses as R&D. Some firms in Australia have argued, like software firms say, everything we do is R&D. R&D is what we do. That is it. That's our output. That's our thing. So they relabel all their expenses as R&D. So many studies have looked at the impact of R&D tax incentives for business. So do they increase innovation? So they typically take patenting as an indicator of innovation. And the evidence is that they do increase patenting. Okay, for example, a recent paper here by a number of authors, including John Van Reenen and others. So that's good, right? Give firms tax incentives, they innovate and apply for patents. But there are some problems with using patents as an indicator of innovation. So patenting is done by a narrow range of industries. The use of trademarks and secrecy for protecting IP, intellectual property, are more commonly used. And for Australia, patents are mainly used in manufacturing and mining. But even for those industries, secrecy is used more frequently. If you apply for a patent, you need to make public what you're doing. And so many firms don't want to do that. It's expensive to do. And so they don't want to pay, and they don't want to make their innovations known to others. So this is from a paper by a couple of former students of mine. They were looking at use of patent and secrecy shares by innovators, did a breakdown of firm sizes and industries. And you see, the patent share here for manufacturing and mining is the highest of all these industries, but even those industries use secrecy more. So overall, about 2.5% of all registered businesses and 4.5% of innovative firms in Australia use patents to protect their innovation. This share of patent users is comparable with other countries. So the problem then with using patents as an indicator of innovation include the following: that it's really only focusing on a small part of innovation in the economy. It's likely that tax incentives increase the incentive for firms to patent. They want to show that they've done something with the money they've received from the government. They could get audited, so best apply for a patent. They also may use the tax incentive to cover the cost of the patent. So it's no new innovation, really. It's just it's now worth patenting. Now they're getting some money for it. And they might have done the same innovation, but use secrecy to protect the IP if they weren't recipients of the R&D tax incentive, the RDTIs. Additionally, not all patents are good. Some patents are designed to block innovation. Other problems. I'm really dumping on patents here. There's this huge literature on this. So R&D tax incentives increasing patenting is not the same as the tax incentives increasing productivity growth. Patents don't equal productivity. Even if R&D tax incentives do increase productivity growth, is that the best way to use the same amount of money? And a lot of these studies that look at this connection, they do not look at that. Say, okay, it increased patenting, innovation, that will likely lead to productivity, they assert, but they don't say whether that was the best way of using the money to achieve the policy goal. Finally, this quote here, the case against patents can be summarized briefly. There is no empirical evidence that they serve to increase innovation and productivity unless productivity is identified with the number of patents awarded, which, as evidence shows, has no correlation with measured productivity. But this hasn't stopped people. Still doing work on this. So what am I going to do? That's what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to look at R&D incentives and look at patenting and things like that. So I'm going to build on some work I did with a former student, Amani Al-Nasri, and use a similar kind of model, but with some twists. So I'm going to think of production in an economy. Apologies for those of you who don't like maths. This is just a few slides, and I really don't need this model, but it helps focus the mind. Okay? So we've got output Y is, I'm missing an F here. It's a function of these things. So there's a technology parameter A, and there should be an F, and then brackets there before the F before the bracket. So it's a function of labor, capital, and capitalized public R&D inputs. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is take the public funding for R&D for Australia for these different sources like R&D tax incentives and higher education research. I'm going to say, well, those investments don't just last that period. They're an investment in capital. And this, like anything else, so for example, for universities, the research generates knowledge capital. So you can't just look period on period. You've got to aggregate all this up. So this also builds in, it removes the idea to think about lags. You don't have to think about lags too much here, because when you're looking at a capital stock, it's the result of all the investment that's happened before that period. Right? So if you're just looking at investment, you think, well, this investment this year, when is it going to translate into productivity? And you have to think there's some lag there. But if you capitalize things, the knowledge capital, for example, that's available to you in one period as a result of all the investments that have taken place previously. Okay, so just to focus the mind here, assume a Cobb-Douglas production function, and so you get something like this. So and we're going to take log, so it's a log of output, this log of the technology parameter, and then we've got labor and capital with parameters on them, and we've got this capitalized R&D, public R&D. We're assuming the A parameter is actually made up of two components, and log of A is composed of alpha and an error term. Okay, and we're assuming this epsilon here on labor and capital, it's made up of two components, an S and a D. So the S is the factor income share. It's the standard thing, if we've got perfect competition, it turns out that the coefficients on labor and capital in Cobb-Douglas production function are the factor shares. But we've got this, we're allowing a DX term to say, well, that assumption could be wrong. And there could be imperfect competition. That factor shares only come into play when you've got perfect competition. So we're saying, well, that may not be the case. And so there could be some spillovers from the fact that we don't have perfect competition, or that factor is contributing more than accounted for in the production function, by making the assumption that factor shares are appropriate parameters. Okay, reorganize this. We're going to bring this bit here over here, so it's y minus log of y minus log of the x term. So that's what we've got there. We've got the factor shares in there. And what are we left with? We're left with this stuff here that hasn't been included here. So we've still got labour and capital here because this is taking into account the imperfect competition or spillovers from labour and capital. And we've got this free public funding of R&D capitalised. And we've got some Zs. These are other things which are not taken into account in calculation of productivity. So we take this difference and we've got this other stuff, and this difference is the standard measure of productivity growth. Right? If you take the exponent, it's output divided by inputs. So this is MFP. In practice, what we're doing here is just, using the ABS's calculation of MFP. It's just the same. All you have to do is take, for this factor share here, we assume that it's half the shares of the two periods in the index. And that ends up being the Turnquist index. So we're not doing anything crazy. We're not estimating a Cobb-Douglas production function to get MFP. We're just taking ABS's definition of MFP. Okay, and we're going to try and explain it by these factors here. Okay, some notes on the data, which I don't have time to go through, but I will say that I cleverly built in a lag into things here. Because you've got to work out, when you do the capitalization, you've got to work out the initial starting value, use perpetual inventory method to build it up. And I made the capital stocks beginning of period capital stocks, whereas everything else is end of period. So it's realized MFP at the end of each period. So there is a lag in things. So there's, and yeah, I'm happy to answer more questions about the data afterwards. So here's, I'm sorry if this is a bit difficult to see. This is one of the figures I produced last night through blurry eyes. So this is the real public funding in 2020-21 dollars. So these are the investments, not the capitalized values. Just to give you an idea of what's been happening with public funding. So it's all in 2020, $21. So the line up the top here, this is higher education sector. So this is research grants to universities, including block funding grants. The line here that has this big hump up here, that's the business enterprise sector, and that is R&D tax incentives mainly. Okay, so HES is higher education sector, BES is business enterprise sector, and that's that. There were changes to the tax incentive system around there. This is the research agencies or research activities by government. It's the CSIRO mainly, and then multi-sector is this one here, health research, and that's been growing strongly in recent years. Okay. What you've all been waiting for. Table with lots of numbers on it. Okay, so this is spillovers from public funding. So this is MFP growth. So I could do all these regressions in levels. I'm going to look at growth because that's where the main policy interest is. What can drive productivity growth? Not what can explain the levels of MFP accumulated over time. So I've got the growth of labor. So G means growth. This is growth of labor, growth of regular capital. This is growth in the business cycle variable. This is growth in the terms of trade. This is growth in total government or public funding for R&D. Okay, so let's just look at, there's two regressions here. There should be a line, well, maybe I should put a line down the middle here. This is the first regression, and we're looking for stars. Stars are good. And we see there are a few stars here, but what we're particularly interested in is this one here. So this says that there is a positive and statistically significant impact of R&D government funding in Australia. So that's good. But that's just the total. So is there one way of spending money which is more effective than any of the others? So the second regression, instead of having the total, it's broken down by the different categories. So this is the growth in research agency, like CSIRO funding. Nothing there. It's not no stars. So it's not statistically significant. We've got business enterprise sector. So this is the R&D tax incentives. Yes, we've got a star. So there's only one star. We like more stars, more significant. There's one star. So that's good news. The bad news is that it has a negative sign in front of it. So fund R&D support for the business enterprise sector, which is mainly R&D tax incentives, this says it actually reduces productivity growth. Then the growth in higher education sector support, yeah, stars, that's good, and it's positive. You can't imagine my relief when that came out. So that suggests that giving money to universities helps raise productivity growth. And then there's a multi-sector, so this is mainly health research. It's not statistically significant. Now that's not unsurprising, because if most of it is health research, you'd expect the productivity effects to work through with very, very long lags. So it's not to say it's not useful to do that research, but typically it would eventually show up through a more productive workforce in the future, healthier, happier workforce in the future. But I said I was going to break productivity down into components, and a lot of funding, a lot of the talk about funding is about how to improve innovation. And what people typically mean by that is technical progress, not just productivity, pushing out the frontier. Well, I decompose productivity into these different components so I can look at that. So here are the same sort of regressions, but not on MFP, but on a component of MFP, which is just technical change. Again, we find that total funding is significant and positive. Nothing here except spending on higher education research funding. Okay. What about efficiency change? Maybe giving R&D tax incentives to businesses will help them manage their resources better. Well, we do see a couple of other statistically significant coefficients here. So this is the research agency, CSIRO, very significant and negative. So that doesn't help us. Business enterprise sector, again, significant, but also negative. So it suggests that giving R&D tax incentives to businesses actually increases in efficiency. And higher education, somewhat surprisingly, I wasn't expecting this, but it actually can help improve efficiency as well. Maybe there's business schools teaching firms, future managers, how to better manage resources. The multi-sector, again, has got a negative sign. So bottom line, and now you see why I told you earlier that I committed to giving this talk and said what I was going to do. I was going to talk about the impact of this before even knowing the results. It's because the results have turned out quite well for the sector which I work in. So just to reassure you, these were not results generated to fulfill my biases about that or try and show something. So the basic idea here is that funding university research is a good idea if the policy goal is to increase productivity growth. R&D tax incentives might have other objectives, but if your policy goal is to increase productivity, technical change, efficiency, then R&D tax incentives don't seem to be the way to do that. So thank you. I will now take your questions, complaints, and expressions of outrage.
That's great. Thank you very much, Kevin, for a really interesting presentation. There was several points in there that kind of made me think. One was around whether we're actually measuring success the right way, and if we're not, what is that actually doing for the types of choices that we're actually making, which I think was a really good reminder, but also really struck by your comments around what government intervention does achieve. And I was quite interested too if you had any thoughts on what types of government interventions might support improved use of resources as a way to kind of drive productivity growth too. But I might just start perhaps with a question from the floor while we get the ones online going. What am I saying here? Invite you to raise your hand so we can provide you with a microphone if needed, and please introduce yourself briefly before asking the question. So I can see we've got Michael at the back already, so we can start with Michael's question. I'll take a couple from the room and then I'll go back online again.
Yeah, Michael Riddell. Just a question about your final results, the efficiency change, but would you like to sort of expand on what might explain that result? I mean, when you showed the technological change one, I thought, wow, this is really impressive. And then I see the efficiency one and I go, what's the possible plausible connection by which R&D funding for universities increases the overall efficiency of use of businesses?
Well, as an economist who works in a business school, I like to think we help people learn about efficient use of scarce resources. And I'm sure many of my colleagues in other disciplines in the business school also think that they're contributing to management expertise, growing leaders of the future, et cetera. And they do research on this. I mean, what is effective workplace organization, behavior, et cetera. This perhaps also touches on a previous productivity slowdown in the 70s and early 80s, which is known as the computer or PC paradox, that we would see computers everywhere except in the productivity statistics. So one of the arguments around that was, well, yes, we think that PCs are going to improve productivity. We just don't know how to use them in the workplace. So one of the arguments given why we eventually saw some productivity growth in the mid-90s was that workplaces had to reorganize to effectively use those new technologies. And the same arguments are being made these days about all these new digital devices and ways of doing business, that we need to work out how to use them effectively. And perhaps university research is contributing to that. Yeah. Yeah. Just, doing a lot with very little money, I'd say. Look, I can come up with stories like this. I don't know. I'm just presenting the numbers as they've come out. So, yeah.
Thank you. I think there was a question in the front here. Yes.
Kia ora, tēnā koe. Thank you so much, Kevin. That was really, really interesting. I work for a Crown Research Institute, so I will admit I was waiting until we got to the end, and then was very disappointed to see the results. However, I don't understand. I still don't understand exactly how you arrived at that result, but I'm going to put that to the side because I have a completely different question, which is how sure can we be that the productivity slowdown is actually a real productivity slowdown that we care about? And I'm thinking in particular about the graph you had where you showed different sectors and their productivity, and the greatest productivity drops in Australia were in construction and in mining. And it started happening at around about the time when, I mean, it's been a long progress since, New Spring and whatever in the 70s, but as I imagine, new environmental regulations were being applied. So is it possible that there was not actually, if we're measuring things other than money, is it possible that there wasn't really a productivity slowdown? It was just that they were having to do other things. That if we're measuring not just for money, the environmental outcomes actually mean that their productivity was maybe just flatlining or possibly even increasing a little bit given the other things they were having to achieve. Thank you.
Great question. So this relates to the mismeasurement hypothesis. That is it all just because we don't measure things as well as we used to, or we've always just mismeasured things, and those measurement problems are becoming worse. So some work has been done on that, particularly around the digital economy is one thing, because we take more photos than ever before now, but the whole process of buying a camera, buying some film, getting it developed, all that has disappeared from GDP. Right? We don't do that anymore, but we're actually taking more photos than ever before. Also, phone calls. We're doing calls online, which has zero price, and they're arguably better than the old phone, fixed line calls, because we can do video as well. So there's been a huge improvement in our communications, and yet because we don't pay for it, it's not in GDP. So it's not in our output measure. So that's an area in which I do some research, and people say, well, we're missing out a lot of stuff that's actually being produced in the economy, but it's because it's got a zero price. It's we're not counting it. So I've done work on that. Basically, while these things are important and can be large, the bottom line is there's too much missing output for us to be mismeasuring outputs. What that means is to have productivity growth to have continued to grow at the rate it was previously, we'd need a heck of a lot more output, and there's just not enough. I mean, it's too much would have to be attributed to measurement error, and we can't find enough sources of measurement error that are big enough. But you also raised about the environment. So yes, we need to include the environment into our capital. Now, the ABS includes land for all the sectors that it calculates multi-factor productivity for, which is fantastic. I don't think many agencies around the world do that. Land is, of course, a key component in agriculture, and that's where most national statistical offices that produce MFP, they work out some estimate of land input for agriculture, but they don't do it for the other sectors. The ABS does it for all sectors, manufacturing, finance, insurance services. Now, how well they do that, I don't know. And how well they adjust for quality changes in land, I don't know. And they don't take into account resource depletion well. And so there's a big push on at the moment internationally to try and improve our estimates of natural capital and how we could be usually depleting it and sometimes augmenting it, and to include those measures in productivity growth. So that could be part of what's going on. There is a technical reason for why land could be part of the productivity slowdown across all these countries. Land has gone up in price over this period from about 2004 in particular, at the very time we got this productivity slowdown. Okay, so there's one technical reason why that could be adding to the slowdown, which I won't go into unless prompted. The other one is that just think about the higher prices for land. If you're a business, you have to pay more for your land, either rent or purchasing the land on which you put your factory, for example. If the price is high, you don't have as much money as before to buy capital equipment, for example. And so it crowds out, as higher prices for land crowd out other investments, and that could be contributing to lower productivity growth. Sorry, a very long, meandering answer to your question, but I think, yes, it could be part of the picture, but it doesn't seem like it can be all of the picture.
That's great. I mean, and that sounds like a really interesting area for further research there as well too. Just take one question quickly from the online, and then I'll come back to the audience here. The question is, do you have any comments on the lag or time to realise the benefits from investments in university research? In New Zealand, we are seeing a decline in research funding in real terms, and wondering if you have any insights on the impact this might have over time.
Devastating. Yeah, so Well, the results suggest that it's not a good idea if you have a policy goal of increasing productivity growth. So about the lags, I think I've got that kind of covered by capitalizing the investments over time and building in a lag of that. So it's actually my regressions, it's the growth in capital of the previous period, which influences the current period's productivity growth. So that's how I've structured it there to try and capture some of those lags. I am concerned. In fact, I think the productivity by the numbers report is great. I was really surprised with the lack of emphasis on universities in the report, though. It just doesn't seem to be as big an issue here in New Zealand as it is in Australia. That universities are being turned to as a potential source for future productivity growth, and there's a lot of emphasis on universities working more closely with industry to help the translation from research to applied applications. So I didn't really see that here, which I think should be more of a focus here, the role that universities can play in innovation. And I think because there's not that focus, that perhaps funding can gradually decline over time. But I don't think that's a good thing. My results suggest it's definitely not.
Thank you. Another question just online from Jeff Lewis. So what do you think the strong increase in inefficiency that you find looks like in practice, and what explains the increase?
Okay, well, take something like accommodation services. You have a new player come into that sector, Airbnb, and suddenly you've got a big increase in supply of rooms available for people to rent. So people don't go to stay in hotels, they go and stay in someone's house. So what happens in the hotels? Well, the hotels were built under a different technology. If you're a hotel, you can't adjust your capital easily. You can't sell off a corridor of your hotel. Just, we're going to get rid of the 6th floor west corridor rooms. That is hard. So there's kind of a stranded asset there in that case. The hotels would have too many rooms for the new environment now that this technological disruption has come. So that will show up as inefficiency. And I think that's the way it should show up, that they've got empty rooms, occupancy rates go up. That's the way we should think about it. We shouldn't think about that as hotels having lower productivity growth. They've got increased inefficiency. It's not that they've suffered technical regress. It's that they're not making as efficient use of the assets now as they did in the past. That they've got empty rooms, and that's been because of disruption in the industry. And it'll take time for that to work through in the case of hotels. Typically, they have to wait until the building depreciates enough that it's worthwhile knocking it down and building a new one at an appropriate size for the technology at the time. So that's an example about how you can get inefficiency growing with an external disruption. But there can be things like regulation, policy changes that that distort incentives. Maybe the new Ministry of Regulation will look into that.
We'll be sure to put that on our list. I will go to Simon next. Simon, wait there.
Thank you, Kevin. Simon Wakeman from the, the Innovation Policy team at MB. So very sort of disposed to believe your results, particularly showing the benefits of R&D expenditure by government. But I mean, what I can see, you've found a correlation between higher education expenditure on R&D and productivity growth. But to believe that, I would need to know that there's nothing else that could be driving both higher education expenditure and productivity growth. I mean, it seems at this stage you haven't done anything to make sure that that is not the case. I mean, what things would you look at to be sure that you're not just seeing a correlation driven by something else?
Yes, great question. So first, the regressions I showed you have all the public funding sources in there. So it's not just looking at higher education on its own. I have done those regressions as well, and generally the same results. But the other things are in there as well. So the region research agency support, the business enterprise sector support, they're all in the same regression. So, but it's the higher education support which is showing up as statistically significant and positive, not the others. So that suggests that there is something special about the relationship between that type of funding and productivity growth, not the other types of productivity growth. To capture other things going on in the economy, currently I've got two other variables in there: the business cycle, which captures the general business environment, and the terms of trade, which is usually included in regressions like this, similarly, because it's thought to impact the general, be an indicator of the general well-being of the economy. If the terms of trade are going up, then probably times are booming. So those are included in the regression. Other things that could be included and typically included in these sort of regressions where you're looking for explanations of productivity at the macro level include a measure of openness, which is basically imports and exports added up included. I don't really know how that would add much here. And public infrastructure. But that changes slowly, particularly over time, particularly in Australia. I don't think that's going to affect the results. A lot of the spending on public infrastructure in Australia has been on things like desalination plants, which don't produce anything. So it's hardly going to affect productivity growth in Australia. Yeah.
I mean, my alternative hypothesis would be there's something about the structure of the economy that where higher education expenditure is correlated with things that are changing in the economy. So that is what's driving productivity growth rather than the expenditure on higher education.
So what things? What would you?
Well, shift between different industries. From, say, moving from agricultural to mining, or moving from manufacturing to services, or things like that might, I mean, it's a hypothesis, but I think it'd be worth exploring, something you could do at a macro level.
Okay, I'll add that to the list of things to explore. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Really interesting. Corey Allen from MB as well. If I understood correctly, your measures of knowledge capital was public investments in R&D, correct?
Yeah.
What about private sector investments? That seems to be, from Simon's question about omitted variables, that seems a big one to me, particularly your earlier discussion about tax incentives and do they actually generate any additional spending? Well, would that just be consistent with your results of the business sector there?
Yeah, so that the private investments are captured in the capital, the standard capital variable. So that's the growth in GCAP there. That's the growth in private capital. So that could be influenced by R&D tax incentives. So they could provide firms incentives to invest more, which would increase capital. But the thing is, that's captured by the ABS statistics. So I don't have to do anything about that because R&D is already in there. Most countries now, after getting UN guidance on this, capitalize R&D as the SNA 08 revisions. That R&D should be capitalized. So that's already in there. But the thing is that just more capital, or does that lead to productivity growth? And that's why I'm talking about spillovers here. And this expenditure, is that providing something in addition to just providing incentives to invest in more capital? Or more labor, or other things. Yeah.
I'll just flip back to a question online. Thank you. There's one here from Grace, which I think is about the sort of value of the spend. And it's really around, how much more should we be increasing spending, public expenditure, I guess, on R&D? Should we be aiming to align with the OECD average, or is it more about a shift in the composition of that spending that's important?
Yeah, great question. I don't know what the appropriate level is. And in Australia, there's this big push now, 3% of GDP, and it's really getting ahead of the OECD average, 2.7%. Let's go for 3%. I don't understand where that justification comes from. Why not, 3.1%? Seems like a very round number, and I don't know if that's ideal. I'd be quite happy if it's 2%, but 2% well spent. So I don't know. And of course, there are trade-offs to things. So you say you want the nation as a whole to be investing 3% of GDP in R&D. Perhaps you have other social goals other than just increasing productivity. You may be interested in inequality as well. I'm not getting into that debate. I'm just saying, if you're going to spend money, what's the most rate? And the policy goal is to increase productivity. What is the most effective way of doing that? And that's where I end, not talking about the appropriate level.
That's great. A very diplomatic answer. Thank you. I've got one here from Christy as well, which is the proportion of tertiary educated people in Australia has trended up over decades. How do you reconcile that with the productivity slowdown?
Yeah, so I should try and be diplomatic about this as well. Look, there are more tertiary institutions educating more students, and not all of them are very high quality tertiary institutions.
Thank you very much. I'll go back to the room now. I think there's someone in red at the back there. Sorry, I'm identifying clothes colours. It's easy.
Kia ora, I'm Mara Walkenhauer. I work for the Department of Conservation normally, but I'm currently seconded to the Future Pathways team at MB. And I've got maybe a philosophical question, Kevin, about how much do you trust the data? So I've got this tiny little story that I'm going to say. I'll be very short. I was trying to help somebody at MB to get the right data about R&D spend at DOC and the definition and what does DOC report to Stats New Zealand and what do they report to MB on their own internal R&D spending, because there are scientists at DOC that do their own research and development. And I was very shocked about the different definitions and the potentially not really great understanding at the different areas. So is this like an outlier, or could there potentially be other organizations who report their R&D spend differently? Specifically, I'm thinking about CSIRO, which actually stands for Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization. And so the tech, when I looked at the tech change, I could not believe how they do not have a bigger impact on the tech change. So yeah, do you think it's maybe actually a data problem?
Always great to get a data question. My main area of research is economic measurement. I worry about getting the data right all the time, and I can drive my collaborators and students crazy, sort of ticking, making sure we've got the right data. So very good question. Look, I can't answer that. I don't know how the data are being reported. I know that the government collects the data, and if it's Statistics New Zealand, they'll be doing a very careful job in checking that they're getting the right stuff. But this goes back to an ancient problem that I forget the exact quote, but when surveys were done centuries ago in England, they said, well, it's just the night watchman of a town would just report to the surveyor about what's the economy of the town, and he would just say whatever came into his mind, and that got recorded as statistics. And things are better than then, but you still have to worry about whether people understand fully what they should be reporting on. For businesses, there's very strong incentives to report everything as much as possible as being R&D because there's tax incentives for it. So, you know, you've got a problem there that a lot of what they're reporting as expenditure on R&D is just this relabeling of general expenses. So whether intentional or not, there can still be measurement problems. So I agree. I don't think this can all be explained by measurement problems, though. But, I mean, universities, that's very clear. It's grants awarded, block grants given. That's very clear. So all my numbers come from the government's budget tables. So it's what they've budgeted for and what they've actually spent.
From the room, right at the back there, I think it's Tawhai actually, by the looks of things.
Kia ora, Tawhai Moss Brown, also from MB. I've got a question. Do you have any insight on what factors might moderate the efficacy of your spend in higher education and research? Thinking things like the connectedness of your research to your business community or the ability to commercialize IP, things like that?
Yeah, great question. When you think about the money given to businesses to do R&D and the money given to universities to do R&D, there's a huge difference, and that is peer review. That the businesses, they don't apply for the grants, they just spend the money and then put in tax claims. Universities, university researchers, to get a grant, you have to write a proposal, be very clear about what you're going to do. Your proposal gets sent off to leading academics who will review your work and mercilessly rip into you. And you get a chance to respond, and then a committee of a different committee of peers will then assess the application, the reports, the responses from the applicants, and then decide whether the research gets funded or not. Throughout the process, you have to report to the Australian Research Council or whatever, whichever council you're reporting to. So annual updates on progress, what has been achieved, and then there's a final report where you have to report all the outputs, etc. Businesses don't do that. Right. So there's a big difference in quality control about how the money is being spent on universities and how it's being spent on R&D tax incentives. Even the block grants for universities, that's based on research performance. So the universities get assessed and get allocated funds based on things like their success in getting grants, publications, etc. So I think that explains a lot of the difference, that there's a very rigorous vetting of money given to universities that doesn't seem to exist for the other ways that the money is being spent.
Yes, over there.
Thank you very much. Carl Hansen, private consultant. I've kind of really quite struck, I guess, by quite a lot of the charts that you put up and that commonality of, productivity slowdown in a range of countries, and yet, finding that, I guess, spending on basic science and research, which should be quite, transferable across countries, is having such a sort of closed economy effect in Australia. And so I'm kind of wondering, would you be bold enough to think that, you'd get similar results if you applied the same methodology to other countries' data?
Yeah, great question. So I got into this literature because a friend of mine, Jonathan Haskell, in the UK, did some work, and he and his co-author accredited with saving the UK science budget. Like a new government came in and they said, what's all this money that we're wasting on giving it money to universities to do research? They don't do any practical research. They just write papers that their friends read. We need to get rid of that and redirect those funds to businesses where the real research is done. And the same arguments were being made in Australia as well, around the same time, that stop giving money to universities. It's a waste. Just give it to business because they know how to innovate. The model, the basics of the model here with the little Cobb Douglas thing and the spillovers, that comes from Haskell and Wallace, their paper, and they found, they took into account other things like different types of intangible investment to try and improve the measurement, take into account a lot of the missing things in the official statistics, and they found very strongly that spending on universities and particularly research councils that fund university grants, that was the most effective way of supporting a policy of raising productivity growth. So I got involved in Australia in the Prime Minister's Science, Innovation and Engineering Council report. There was a report to them on this. I was with distinguished scientists on this committee, including the guy who led the team that developed Wi-Fi at CSIRO. And that's how I wrote a paper with my former PhD student, Amani El-Nasri, and we used the Haskell and Wallace approach, and we got exactly the same results. So what's different here is that I'm not getting not muddying the waters with trying to do intangibles, redoing the accounting. I'm just using the official statistics, and I'm doing the breakdown of productivity to technical change and efficiency change, and I still get the same results. So it seems to be happening in different countries, at least 2 different countries, and the results seem to be robust to the different ways you measure your inputs, whether you include a broader range of intangibles, whether you capitalize the public R&D funding or just take it as an investment, period by period investment, whether you're doing levels or growth rates, seems to be very robust, and that was the same in the UK. I'd hope to do something like this for New Zealand, but I only got this done on Monday night, so
I'm sure it won't take more than 24 hours to turn around the results for New Zealand as well. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. I'll just do one online from Sharon, which is once again back to the higher education side of this as well. So just here, but I think Sharon raises an interesting point, which is, could your findings about the strong productivity effects of universities to some extent reflect spillovers from university graduates, or from the connection between universities and industry, rather than the new knowledge being generated from the universities itself?
Yeah, I mean, is it new knowledge or a more effective translation of that knowledge? The funding here is for research grants. It's not funding to support improving the connection with industry. Having said that, the success rates in getting linkage grants in the Australian Research Council grant schemes are much higher than for the regular grants. So linkage grants are where you've got an industry partner, and so they have to kick in some money as well. They can be very rewarding, it can lead to some great research, but they can be incredibly hard to manage because industry works on different timeframes than academic research typically. Like you get a 5-year ARC linkage grant, and your industry sponsor after 6 months wants to know the results, and you say, well, if it was that easy, you wouldn't need a 5-year grant. But there are increased incentives even through the grant schemes to try and improve those linkages with industry. But the fundamental thing is that it's all through research. It's innovative new research, not recycling old research and turning it into a linkage. So yeah, I think it is the new research which is having the impact.
Great, thank you. So do we have any last questions? Oh gosh, I've got to go now, choose between Hamid and Patrick. This is hard. Hamid, I'll try and get both of you in. Hamid quickly and then Patrick, and we may need to close after that.
Oh, great stuff. Thank you very much, Kevin. I was thinking that, well, you have looked at R&D support in as a broad umbrella, but we know that we can break it down, right? There are different types of R&D. It's not all about production line. It could be marketing, could be governance, practices, improvements, and that sort of thing. there are other ways as well. Last time we mentioned, we had a chat about Professor Webster. I think she's arguing that you don't, if you, let me say it this way. She's, I think, saying that Australia is small, so you don't need to generate new technologies. You better invest in localizing existing technologies and using it in a practical thing. So I guess my question is, do you think you will get a slightly different result if you look at breakdown of R&D expenditures?
Between R&D expenditure that is entirely blue sky new stuff versus adapting foreign research. I don't know how you'd do that breakdown, because we all stand on the shoulders of the giants that preceded us, and they can be from anywhere in the world. So that would seem rather complicated to do, but there is this argument that, and it's been made in Australia, that we don't need to do research domestically. We just need to import it. We're a relatively small country. Let's just let the US do all the research. They can spend their public funds doing that, and we'll just be the beneficiaries of that. Well, the problem is you lose sovereign capability. You become reliant on someone from overseas, and what if they decide they want to keep all the good ideas for themselves? If it's medical research, how long are you going to be happy watching another country having wonderful new health treatments while people are dying of the same diseases in your country? So I think sovereign capability in research is extremely important, not only for having innovations that adapt foreign knowledge to your local circumstances, but to invent new things which are important to your circumstances and your environment. So I think there could be something you could look at around that, but it'll be extremely difficult, and I don't know how to do that. But just as a matter of a bottom line here, I think countries doing research, funding research appropriately, is incredibly important for the long-run economic growth.
And one last quick question from Patrick, just fairly quick, please.
Kia ora, Kevin. Thank you for the presentation, and I've really enjoyed the discussion today. I guess, Patrick Nolan from the Treasury, New Zealand does need to lift its productivity performance. So I think this has been a very important discussion to have. And I was really struck by the Australian MFP figures that you put up, and whether or not that increase in MFP over recent years is if you think it's real and sustainable, which also gets me thinking about, you've done a lot of work on technological change. And should we be technological optimists or pessimists? And do you think technology for a country like New Zealand that's distant, businesses that don't have scale, sort of a lack of competitive intensity, do you think technology is going to sort of help us?
Yes. I'll add a few more words. Yeah, so I'm a technology optimist. Look, there's an expression, technological anxiety. We're worried about the productivity slowdown, and we're saying, where's all the technology that's supposed to be giving us higher living standards? On the other hand, we're saying, well, look at all the technology that's going to make us unemployed. So we're anxious in both ways. And currently, artificial intelligence, people are saying, well, what are humans going to do once the algorithms take over? Well, we'll find other things to do. Like there are a huge number of jobs that exist now that never existed back in the days when the cotton ginny was, spinning ginny was introduced. We've gone through these periods of displacement by new technologies, and humans have prospered. We'll find new jobs, productivity will increase. We'll go through difficult times, and we'll wonder where the next lot of technology is coming from. There are cycles of this, but I'm extremely positive, and I think there's countries that are nimble, flexible, open, will do well, and if they're quick in adopting new technologies. So very positive about the future.
Kia ora, thank you so much for that. Unfortunately, we have now ran out of time and we do need to bring today's events to a close. But I want to say a very big thank you, Kevin, for joining us here in Wellington and taking the time to share your interesting insights with us. I think it has been a really rich conversation. So thank you to all of you for the really insightful questions you've been asking as well too. And to those online also for joining us, given the weather outside does look a bit miserable in Wellington today. I've just been reminded we do have nibbles outside. So if you want a bit of a networking opportunity and a cup of tea and a cup of coffee and some nibbles, please join us after this event. We do have many more exciting speakers coming up in this series, but I now have to say next year, which sounds slightly scary to me. But do please keep your eye out for updates on the Treasury website about that. So I'm just going to close off with the Treasury karakia. So piki te kaha, piki te ora, piki te wairoa, huie, tai kie. Thank you very much, everyone. Mā te wā.